Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Paint Mind Studio. My name is Diana and in today's video I will be showing you how to draw these pretty flowers in real time. You will be able to see how I put down every mark on the paper as I draw it, and I will explain my process as I go. I will then show you how to bring these tropical beauties to life using only watercolors. You're not going to want to miss this one, so grab your favorite drink, grab your art supplies, and let's create another beautiful flower sketch together. Okay, I have one sketchbook that I tend to use only for my flower illustrations, and that is this little watercolor sketchbook from Arteza. It is 5.5 inches square. I got it on Amazon. It isn't always available, but if I can find it for you, then I will link it down below in the description box, along with everything else I like using. If you're a returning viewer, then you know we've been filling in this little book together. So far, only 5 pages out of 88 have been filled in, so yeah, as I clip down the pages, I'm realizing we should probably do more flowers so we can finally finish this sketchbook one day. Another returning favorite is, of course, my TWSBI Eco Tea fountain pen with a fine nib. It responds beautifully to my every command and is gentle enough for drawing delicate flowers, so here we go! Usually I like to have at least one flower that is fully open and facing forward, the reason being that a fully open flower will help to more accurately, visually identify the type of flower that's being depicted. These particular flowers have 5 petals of equal size, and those petals tend to overlap to a certain extent, so I'm going to want to show that. And in doing so, it makes sense to place this fully open flower front and center. In this instance, all the petals will be overlapping a bit, so it doesn't really matter what petal you decide to start with, because they're all being drawn in the same manner. I started with the uppermost petal just because I'm right-handed and it's more comfortable for me. I also start at the base of almost all the petals because I'm drawing semi-continuous lines, and that initial line has no breaks in it, unlike the lines that come after the tip of the petal, which end midway. Once I'm done drawing the form of the petals, I then start adding some small irregular lines on the edges of the petals to indicate small folds. These folds help to initiate the separation we want to make from a flat, one-dimensional flower to a more three-dimensional flower. Zooming in now, so you can better see the addition of the little stamen in the center of the flower, of which there are also only 5. Using fine hairline strokes, I'm also drawing the main veins of the flower, which are usually situated in the very center of their petals. The way to achieve hairline strokes, as you may already know, is to simply hold your pen loosely as you reach the end of your line. Quickly lift your pen while in motion. I now want to start adding interest around the main flower by adding another bloom just above it for the sake of the composition. Drawing it to look exactly like the first flower is not going to add anything to the illustration, so I want to make sure that I include enough variation in it to separate it from the main flower. The way I'm doing that is by drawing these petals in the front at a more extreme angle, meaning those specific petals are turned towards us, so they will have more of that angled perspective and they will be a bit more curled into themselves, especially at the tips. The petals coming out behind them also need to display some variation, so I'm including a few more folds in those as well and adding their main veins in the same way as before. The petal all the way to the left, I need to draw with a sideways angle, since visually it's coming out of one of the front petals, which already has its own extreme angle to begin with. This will help the flower look more realistic. Moving on to the last bloom, I'm placing that one in the next big empty space I have, which is to the left of the main flower, and I'm drawing it very much in a similar way to the last bloom, but with little changes here and there so that it doesn't look exactly like the one I just drew. I'm doing that by changing the shape and size of the petals slightly, by making the curls of the petals thinner in certain areas and by changing slightly the angles of the petals. Now I'm adding what is to be the main stem of our plant. I decided to make the stem a bit more delicate. Part of that includes drawing it with finer strokes instead of heavy lines. I'm now adding a bud to the right where there was some empty space, again for the sake of the composition. The buds of this particular flower are very simple. They're basically just little baby petals wrapped around each other. So all you have to do is draw these little static twirls, keeping in mind that the flower only has 5 petals. For a moment now, I'm briefly adding a little bit of what will eventually become the shading process. The shading will be made up entirely of fine hairline strokes, both big and small, because that's how I like to shade my flowers. I'm adding another little stem so that the flower in the back there won't look like it's just floating in the air like a bad AI illustration. I've decided to add one last bud in the space between the 2 back flowers and the shading for it while I'm at it, again just to eliminate some of that emptiness. To complete the composition, I'm now adding some leaves, very simple ones. These flowers do not have elaborate leaves, and since they primarily grow on trees, they tend to have semi-large leaves. I, however, am limited by the size of the page, so I have to keep my leaves proportional to the space I'm working on. So, in short, I'm drawing them large, but relative to the size of the page. I'm now adding the veins of this leaf here. When drawing leaf veins, you want to make sure you vary your strokes. For instance, you do not want to draw your veins from the center of the leaf all the way out to the outer edge of the leaf. That's going to look too monotonous. You need to vary your strokes by making some veins long and some veins short, and others something in between. Maintain variety. I also recommend you use fine strokes. Too many thick lines will make the illustration look too unrealistic. Now begins what, to me, is the best part of any illustration, the shading. All the marks I'll be adding now are the things that will really show what these flowers are doing. The shading will emphasize every curve and angle of the flowers. It will emphasize the petals and will give the overall illustration the dimension it's been lacking up to this point. Once the shading is in place, only then will every little curl and angle, every detail I drew, that's when it will all make sense and bring cohesion to the illustration. When shading the very center of the flowers or any single specific area of the flowers, I'm making sure I'm starting my lines from the same point and following the natural contours of the flower's form. This will make the darkest areas of the shading build up more naturally. In this way, I'm creating depth more organically. Plus, it looks prettier since flowers are delicate and don't really benefit from strong, harsh lines. At least not with my drawing style. One last tip I can offer in case you're having trouble shading is to look at the colors of the flowers. Whether you're already familiar with the flower you're drawing or you're using a reference, look at the colors, and wherever the darkest colors are, that's where you're going to want to place your deepest shading. For flowers, it's pretty simple because their deepest shadows and deepest colors as well will usually be in the center. Lastly, I'm completely relying on fine hairline strokes, as I mentioned earlier, for pretty much the entirety of the shading process on the flowers, as you can see for yourselves. And to help me explain these kinds of marks, for any illustration I do, I often refer to it as flicking. I'm flicking my pen off the paper as I end my mark. You may have heard me use this term several times in some of my previous videos. This is going to conclude the ink portion of the video. Thank you, my beautiful Twisby, for never failing me. I should give it a name, it's so good. Now for the painting process, I'm starting off with my Escoda round travel brush in size 2. I like this one because even though it's small, it's a nice thirsty brush, so it's perfect for what I'm about to do. I'm grabbing a lemon yellow from my Paul Rubens set on the right of the screen there, and I've watered it down enough so that its translucence will be noticeable. I'm putting that color at the bottom of the petal and bringing it up about midway. Then I'm grabbing a tiny bit of clean water and brushing it along the upper edge of that lemon yellow to soften up the color so that no harsh line forms. Then I'm grabbing some, I believe it's just called Scarlet, and I'm placing a little watered down bit of it right at the bottom center of the petal while the lemon yellow is still wet. Lastly, I'm grabbing that same scarlet color, less watered down, straight from the pan, and placing a bit of it right at the bottom to deepen the shading found in that area. All of this is being done while everything is still wet. And I'm literally just repeating that process for every single one of the petals. You will see that process repeated about 2 or 3 more times, and then I'll be moving on. Using that same watered down lemon yellow, I'm now adding just a little bit of color to the very bottom of all the curls of the petals. I'm switching brushes now. This one is my Cotman Round, another size 2, but this one is less thirsty and therefore holds a finer point. I don't want a very thirsty brush for this next part. Up at the top is my Prima Tropical set, and from there I'm grabbing a pink color called Sunset, which is a more pinky, cooler sort of magenta. I'm placing a very small amount of that color at the very tippy top of the petal. Then I'm grabbing a very small amount of clean water and I'm running that water along the very edge of the color I just put down so it's still wet, and I'm letting that color run freely into the water I just put down. This will create the soft effect of that pink color fading away gently into the white of the flower. So I'm also utilizing negative space in this one for the white of the flowers. Once again, I'm repeating that process for every single petal. You'll see me do all this several times before I move on. For this petal I'm working on now, I'm adding some of that sunset color all along the outer edge of the curl. This is just to indicate the tiny bit of shading one would see under that curl of the petal. Now I'm preparing a different color from the same tropical set as before called Paya, which is a redder, warmer tone of magenta. I'll be needing this color in a moment. So for the buds, I'm starting off with that sunset color from earlier, watered down, and I'll be filling in each little segment of the bud one at a time. While that color is still wet, I'm then using the Paya color for the areas that I shaded earlier with my fountain pen. So basically, I'm keeping the buds super simple by using the lines I drew earlier as my guides for where to put the color. And this Paya color that I've chosen, I'm utilizing as my darker pink value to create more contrast so that these little buds won't look too one-dimensional. I'm now going back to my Paul Rubens colors and taking a very olive type of green, a sort of sap green, which in this set is called True Green, I think. I'm keeping it slightly watery and putting it down in the center area of the bud stem, but without filling in the whole thing. Then I'm taking that Paya color from the tropical set and I'm placing it right at the bottom of the bud and at the bottom of the stem, and I'm letting those two colors mix on their own right on the paper, letting them do their thing. It creates a beautiful effect, which is a little hard to see in such a small area, but it'll still be noticeable. For this longer segment of bud here, I'm doing something just slightly different. I'm putting a bit of the sunset color down without filling in the entire segment. I'm then taking some clean water to soften the unfinished edge, and then I'm putting a bit of the Paya color, my darker value, right over my ink lines while everything is still wet. I did the same thing to that little tiny bottom area, and I'm using just a smidge of clean water to help blend it all in smoothly. I painted that little bit of stem in the back the same as the last one, and I've now moved on to the bigger stem, doing the same thing as before and letting the colors blend on their own right on the paper. Again, I'm using True Green from Paul Rubens and Paya from the Tropicals. I'm also waiting for the upper segment of this stem to dry completely before doing the bottom segment. Now we're getting so close to the end, I'm starting on the final details at last. I've switched brushes again and I'm now using my Escoda round brush in size 0, and I'm taking a more saturated bit of sunset and painting a very faint line right at the edge of every area of the petal that has pink on it, again just to add a little bit more contrast. Using the same brush, I'm now taking the color Scarlet, more saturated to emphasize the center veins of all the flowers, as well as to deepen the shade of the red centers of the flowers. I've now switched to my Escoda travel brush size 6 and I'm painting the leaves. To do that, I'm grabbing a watered down true green and I'm working in sections, filling in each segment of the leaves wet on dry. Then while that's still wet, I'm grabbing a darker green called Hooker's Green, also from Paul Rubens, and I'm putting in the shadows of the leaves with that color wet on wet. At this point, everything is still damp, so I'm grabbing a less watered down Hooker's Green and I'm adding that to the areas of the leaves where the deepest shadows are situated, so in the center as well as at the base of the leaves. I repeat that process for all the leaves, and I'm leaving it at that because the leaves are already taking up so much of the page and I don't want them to take too much attention away from the flowers. The final step for me is always to add the lettering that I like to include for my flowers, and I explain all this in more detail in my previous flower composition videos, so I'll include a link up in the corner or in the description box, or both. I'm simply writing out one of the many common names for the flower in basic block letters, and then I'm going back and adding each little serif. Those little things I'm putting in on every letter are called serifs. Underneath that is the scientific name, and for that I'm just writing it out in my own little vintage looking swirly printed handwriting. And then I sign it, and that's it. Here's a close-up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you watched the whole thing, you are the best. As always, thanks for being here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!